So with that, please join me in welcoming Todd Krizelman, CEO of MediaRadar, who's going to share some of his thoughts on the market with us.
Perfect. All right, everyone. My name is Todd Krizelman. I'm the CEO and co-founder of MediaRadar, and I'm going to spend the next 15 minutes really talking about something that drives me crazy is when there's a lot of hype about really any topic. I often go back to my desk or I spend time on the weekend and I basically just want to debunk it naturally. It frustrates me. And one of the things that there's an endless amount of hype on right now, and really for the last year, has certainly been around native advertising. Some people call it sponsored editorial or sponsored content. And some of the biggest valuations for companies, whether they're consumer or B2B, have been around businesses that build their business model on top of this type of advertising asset. So for anyone in the room who does not know this type of advertising, this is when you are looking, and this is sort of the official IAB definition, it's an ad that is meant to look like it fits into the editorial feed on a website. And sometimes, but it's not mandatory, it will have a form of paid content or sponsored editorial that only exists because someone paid for it. So I'm going to first talk about a whole bunch of stats that I think are really concerning. We'll start with that. We'll start with the worst case, then we'll talk about what I think is good, and then we'll come back to reality as we wrap up. So one thing that's disconcerting, we track a lot at MediaRadar, is just what is the supply, the number of people selling a particular type of ad unit. Generally, the more unique an ad unit is, the better it sells, the higher CPM, the more there's scarcity, right? So we just listened to Michael talk a lot about economics. This is basic economics of supply and demand. In this case, the supply of this type of ad unit is rocketing. It is up more than 3 times over the last 2 years. And generally, anytime you pour supply on a market, it's not good. It depresses prices. Now, part of the reason, there are sort of 2 reasons we see a lot of this stuff. One is that there are just so many market entrants. Many of those of you in the room are publishing this type of, or selling this type of advertising. But it's also a new group of entrants who are doing something called programmatic native. And this is basically programmatically placing this type of advertising. These companies, which I did not know 2 years ago, most of them are clients, and so we learned a lot about what makes them tick and what makes their businesses grow. Nativo, Triple Lift, Sharethrough, Teads, Bid2Lect, these are companies that have scaled. Every business that's on this list here grew more than 100% year over year. Amazing, but also adding a lot of supply. So, some good news. This is actually amazing. When you think about all the false prophets in our industry, all the things that are like the shiny objects that are supposed to really save publishing, one thing to be certain is that the number of advertisers buying this type of asset is really growing very quickly. So even though we had this huge increase in supply, there is a parallel increase in demand. And the numbers are pretty breathtaking. Even if we look at 2017 actual new brands coming to market, the median number of new brands across both B2B and consumer media, it's 616 per month, who've never bought this asset, this type of advertising in the last 4 years. Another really good sign. So one thing for sure to share is that we see, even though overall everything looks very good, this is an example of CIO Magazine's website. You see this big peak as we get towards the end of the year and it starts to flatten off. And by the way, this is not to pick on them. This is consistent with what we are starting to see just in the last 4 months, is there does seem to be a little bit of a flattening of that S-curve, that euphoria, and we're starting to see fewer investments from private equity firms, PE firms. We actually looked at the dollars invested in companies selling this kind of asset on using TechCrunch data, and basically it's starting to slow. Basically, there's some evidence that despite all of this growth, It's not that the market is stalling or anything, but it's definitely not growing at that same wondrous 3x increase. So one initial takeaway is that supply and demand are increasing. If you wonder why valuations sometimes are very high for companies that have pursued this business model very aggressively, one is just that the number of advertisers is very good. And we're going to get into some real specifics of how this looks under the hood now. So one thing is, whenever we worry that there's hype, you wonder about how much penetration there is into the overall market. And so we looked at all the advertisers buying online, and we said how many of them are in a campaign schedule that they're running, how many of those sites will have any piece of native or sponsored editorial? And it's very low. It's like 10 or 11% every month. And so again, this is a good sign. Basically, it's a healthy sign that the market is continuing to grow. Even if it doesn't grow at the same frothy level it's been the last couple years, it is still very attractive. And by the way, if you're in the room and you're not selling this type of asset, that would be normal. Basically, we see that 90% of campaigns are not winning this. So some interesting insights about what these campaigns look like. So one is that duration of campaigns tend to be very short, right? So if we're talking about a piece of sponsored editorial that AT&T is running, it will not last, very few of them last more than a month or 2 months. It's very short. And as you'll see in the next page, this is not good, right? When we look at renewal rates, when we look at what influences renewal rates, short campaigns that last only a month are basically too short to impact brand perception or sales or whatever the advertiser objective is. And in fact, we see renewal rates are just 33%. This, to state the obvious, this is not good enough. But this is definitely the average right now. There are examples of big successes. So Atlantic Media, which runs both B2B and consumer assets, has or Quartz, they're in the range of 90% renewal rates. And at 90%, the cash flow economics of an ad-driven B2B business are phenomenal. Pretty much any business at that renewal level, it just works very well. But what we see here is it doesn't look like that for most categories at all. Most publishers, you can see on this chart on the far left, you can see that 14% of people are at 10% or less renewal rates, and most people are in that middle, that 30 to 40, 40 to 50 level. And this is not a problem right now while the market is growing super fast, but increasingly it will be. And so let's look at an example. So this was an example of a well-known site that's of scale. They probably have 25 full-time sales reps, so it's a bigger group of sales reps who are selling. They sold 122 sponsored editorial advertisements over a 1-year period. The very next year, they sold 245. Up 100%. This is the sort of level you have a party at. You think about the media industry, and we read how Facebook and Google are probably, or LinkedIn are consuming everything. That's not really what we see. We see dozens of examples that look like this, where companies are up 100% year over year. You have a party for this level. But things aren't what they seem. So if we went in and we were like, wow, what happened to the first 122? 43% renewal rate, a little bit better than the average, but not anything to be super excited about. 28% of advertisers did come back with this exact type of asset, but with a competitor. And 29 stopped buying altogether. So we went back and we actually talked to the 29% because we have a list of them, and we asked why they didn't come back. And many were dissatisfied that they felt like the campaign did not meet its objectives, that it was too expensive. So we sort of gave people a survey they could fill out what were the top reasons. we also went back to the people who did renew, and we looked at the campaign and the editorial that they ran. And one thing that we learned that really stuck out was for people who renew, they run much longer campaign durations. Much longer in this case is 6 to 7 months. And it really stands out. And I can remember at the Folio conference a couple years ago, the CRO of Forbes was talking about Forbes brand voice, and he talked about that the duration was so important. This is all public because he was on stage. I think this is reasonable. He said, look, we learned with a 6-month window, we as the publisher have time to course correct. We have time to evaluate, are we doing our job as a publisher, meeting the advertiser expectation? And sometimes that's changing brand perception. Sometimes that's changing awareness, aided or unaided. Rarely is it to sell something, to have a transaction. And so a lot of times when we went and polled the people who have highest renewal rates, they're not just doing a brand perception study at the end of the 6th month. They're checking in. They'll do a review 3 months in, 5 months in, to make sure the campaign is meeting the advertiser's expectation. So this is very important. Basically, because there are 600 new advertisers coming into this asset every single month, you're able to grow your business 100% year over year. But when the market starts to plateau, when it starts to mature, renewal rates will matter a lot more. And we went a little bit further. We were curious to see, who are the 245 that they're winning? And this is, by the way, could be anyone. We looked across B2B sites, consumer sites, big companies, small companies, and these stats are very, very similar in all. Basically, it just reinforces what the expectation is that it's new business that is driving all of these phenomenal sales numbers and these higher valuations. But when there is no new business to win, right, those renewal rates, again, will really, really matter. So, some key takeaways: phenomenal growth, troubling renewal rates for sure. And some final takeaways on this, just because I think a lot of times, there's a number of conferences and events and training seminars all around native advertising and sponsored editorial and how to implement it best. We found that the people who implement it best, it's not that they're just doing best practice, it's that they've chosen something that they can do very well. And so we found those who defend ROI, who measure. When we do our surveys across hundreds of companies selling this asset, that is one piece of feedback that comes out, which is that they are proactively trying to measure campaign success. Number 2 is to differentiate the offering. This is true like in any business, but it has to be said, right? Not all native or not all sponsored editorial is the same, but choosing something and then defending it goes over well. Another thing is if just because you're watching something at Government Executive at the Atlantic Media Group, which does very well, it does not mean that you have to do the same thing. Avoid the competition, right? Some of the people making the most money are just out doing their own thing, right? In the consumer market, I most associate that with BuzzFeed, right? And so if you're an adult, you're probably, for me, I go to BuzzFeed as a professional looking to understand how someone else is doing this. I don't actually use it as a consumer. But it is really interesting. You will see that their execution and implementation is quite different from almost everyone. And finally, choose a price point. Remember the raise of hands, everyone remember Delta Song? Some people have said yes. Maybe United TED rings a bell from like 10 years ago. This was super popular. Basically, someone says, we own gates, we own planes, we have pilots. We should have both a high-end part of the market and the low-end part of the market. And it's the most recent example of failure. Basically, you can't be both. And so one thing, again, we identified when we looked at success is it didn't really matter if you were high or low priced, but it mattered to really choose one. Those who are in the middle basically end up with a mixed message in the marketplace. Everyone, thank you very much. I appreciate the time today.